And this is the product of my research and consulting work with businesses, nonprofit organizations, community, government officials, higher education and K-12 education leaders and teacher leaders. So a number of people who have shared with me their insights about what we've called regenerative leadership, going beyond sustainability, and what it is that actually has allowed them to be highly effective as regenerative leaders. So you'll see that the framework actually has 4 quadrants. And I borrowed the 4 quadrants from Ken Wilber, an American philosopher who lives in Boulder, Colorado, who had developed this framework of the all quadrants, all levels, and the theory of everything, and other works of Ken Wilber. For those of you who want to go deeper, I would highly recommend it. Another person that I've actually based a lot of my work on is Otto Scharmer at MIT, and Theory U, and his more recent work now in actually envisioning emerging futures. But I'll get back to that. So why 4 quadrants? Well, these 4 quadrants actually represent 4 distinct dimensions of the human experience. Below the surface, we have the interior or the subjective world of individuals and the collective. Above the surface, we have the external world of objects, of behaviors, of society. So these are the 2 dimensions, again, of the individual and the collective. So as we go through the framework, I'll explain what each of these quadrants has and the other elements that make it up. But between the upper level of the objective world, the inner level of the subjective world, is what I call the field of emerging consciousness and empowerment. And this is what Otto Scharmer calls the Eingang. This field, which is the humus or the soil, the nutritional earth, where our consciousness actually emerges into the world of behavior. So, but this soil is what actually we as regenerative leaders actually make fertile so that wonderful things may emerge from it. And what Thich Nhat Hanh, a very famous Buddhist, calls, if you have great soil or a great garden, what is it you would want to share with your friends and your family? Would it be weeds, or would you want to share fruits, flowers, and vegetables? So our job as leaders is not to tell people what to do, but to help provide the nutrition for that soil to go deeper and deeper and deeper into the consciousness of each individual, so that they themselves may empower themselves to become who they should become. And how do we do that? Well, leader, you see here in the bottom left, in the personal mindset, purpose, and worldview, the regenerative leader. And what are these elements of the qualities of consciousness? One is that awakening to that heightened sense of purpose. We have found something that makes a lot of sense, that gives our lives meaning, whether it's sustainability or anything else. It might be art, but then we connect art to sustainability, or education, and we connect that to regeneration, or community organizing, or entrepreneurship, or politics. There is nothing in the human experience that cannot provide a sense of heightened purpose, as if this is what we were here to do. The problem is how we do it. So other qualities of the regenerative leader is creative intelligence. This idea that we cannot just continue thinking in the old ways. We have to come together as individuals and as a collective and really encourage creativity. Without that, we cannot actually find new solutions to the old problems. In order to do that, we need to be able to be well-versed in systems thinking, which is something we'll explore more next week in other frameworks and tools. Global ethics is another fundamental quality which we all have, but we don't always meet. By global ethics, I mean there is nothing wrong with all individuals having this particular individual interests, needs, aspirations, and goals. But those needs and goals and aspirations cannot be left to expand unchecked without considering the common good. Global ethics is how I balance my self-interest with the common interest, with the global need or the global rights to everything to access. And all of this cannot work if I cannot have as an individual the sense that I cannot work in the idea of just the short term. As you were working a project, the short term has to be expanded to the long term. When we talk regeneration, we need to think about 200 years in the future, not less than 50, certainly not 3 months or a year. The human race actually works along the term generations, decades and millennia, centuries and millennia. We cannot go back to shareholder management and quarterly reports. These are not sustainable. So the emerging future of as a quality of the regenerative leader is fundamental, being able to create a vision of an ideal future very much in the future. And then we'll see how we accomplish that. So these mindset components are actually translated in the regenerative leader in behaviors as an individual. And of course, if you have a strong sense of purpose, then your leadership will be purpose-driven. And that purpose will be a high level of purpose, based on ethics, based on a noble and a purposeful vision, which has sustainability as one of its key principles, environmental, economic, and social, but also the well-being of the planet as a whole over the long term. But in order to become a purpose-driven leader, you also need to understand that you cannot learn to be an expert leader if you cannot understand how other people are doing things better than you are. And in order to do that, you have to be able to be humble enough to observe those who are doing things better and to learn from them. That requires you and all of us to be able to deeply listen to each other. And again, I'll be talking about generative dialogue next week, about how we actually reach the capacity to listen deeply to one another without any filters, without judgment. And in order to do that, we have to be able to engage multiple stakeholders, not just our friends or people who look like us, but people who receive the impacts of what we do, our clients, the indirect members of the community with whom we're not even connected, we don't think, until we realize that everything that we do has consequences and affects everything else in the universe. And that is what we call in quantum physics and mechanics the butterfly effect, that everything that we think, everything that we do affects everything else in the universe. And that is a very powerful thought and challenge for us to be very, very ethical and purposeful and mindful as we make decisions in our behaviors. The next quadrant, and you'll see the next quadrant is down here, number 3, is not a cross. Why? Because as I said before, regenerative leaders don't tell people what to do. Actually, foster the collectives through this generative dialogue or conversation. And that generative dialogue actually is not about selling my vision to a group of people or telling people how great it would be to become sustainable. It's actually engaging in an open conversation in order to figure out together what is our vision, our collective vision, and our collective purpose going forward. And this brings in 2 very important concepts. They're very big words, but easy to understand. One is the notion of transconceptual dynamics. The human race, and many of us when we work, we are stuck in using only reason and logic to solve our problems. And if we look at history carefully, it is reason and logic that have created the problems that we have today. Yes, we have fantastic results in technology and science, in some cases, and economics, but also we have the unintended consequences, which are very negative, which are actually bringing our species to the brink of disaster or even extinction. So what do we mean by transconceptual dynamics? What it means going beyond conceptual. In our meetings, are we able to value emotions? Are we able to value intuition, imagination, And the creativity that I was talking about here, this creative intelligence of the collective wisdom that is not rooted in logic and reason, but comes from somewhere else, which I call that spark of inspiration. These are all human faculties that unfortunately in some work environments particularly, these are not allowed, they are discouraged. And these may be the human faculties and the intelligences that can actually bring us the solutions or the ideas of the solutions that we cannot find in our spreadsheets and in our scorecards and in our measurement of data and quantitative data and trying to save 10% of our waste or improving 3% in our carbon emissions. All of this logical work is actually burning out sustainability professionals. We need to find a different way of doing things. We do that by engaging triple loop learning. Again, complicated term that is quite simple. Single loop learning is actually the learning that happens on the assembly line in a factory. That learning is we build a car, we make a product, at the end of the assembly line, that car comes off the assembly line, goes on to the test track, the wheels fall off, we realize we didn't do a good job, we learn the lesson, we put the wheels back on, we go back to that stage, that phase in the assembly cycle, we improve, we train that person, we go through it again, but the system is working fine. That is single loop learning. Double loop learning is when we begin to challenge, why are we doing things this way? Isn't there a better way to do this? And therefore, we actually begin to do things like customized assembly. Toyota and particularly Lexus, you can actually build your own car on order. Dell does the same thing with computers. You can actually design your own computer through Dell by ordering it how you want it. That is more of double loop learning. It also goes into challenging the whys we're doing things, and therefore it challenges the values. But triple loop learning goes further. Triple loop learning is based on the premise that the realization that everything that we're doing is flawed. We may need to consider the need to start all over again in redesigning every human system and operation in order to create a society that is more equitable, environmentally sustainable, financially prosperous, and that can live and prosper over the next 1,000 or 10,000 years with the same quality of life as we have today, or even, obviously, even better. So how does the collective behave? Because this is the equivalent to the individual consciousness. This is the collective consciousness that we as regenerative leaders try to instill or nurture in our organizations or our institutions or schools. So how do we behave? Well, the behaviors of the collective are, one is this idea of backcasting. If you're not familiar with this, or reverse engineering, it's the idea of what is the ideal end state, such as sustainability. In 100 or 200 years, what do we see as the ideal condition in which we want to be living as a species and as a planet? And then we strategically plan backwards from that future to the present by saying, what do we need to do in year 199, 190, 150, 150, and this month and next year. So instead of just creating a strategic plan and seeing what happens, we create an ideal future and then create a strategic plan backwards without the unintended consequences that will inevitably happen when we project a prototype into the future without considering all of these consequences well into that desirable future. This is what we call third order change, where we are using this triple loop learning of the trans-conceptual dynamic to build this collective strategy where we actually prototype a solution, work out all the kinks, thinking about what will this look like 200 years in the future, and then once we've tested that prototype, we can begin to mainstream it, that is to scale it up, in order to try and accomplish that triple top line, which, as I said last week, is How can we grow prosperity, celebrate community, and ensure the health of all species for all time? So what other elements come together in the framework? Well, one is that regenerative leadership is purpose-driven, it's shared, and it's iterative. It is never ending. That's the reason for the infinity symbol. This never ends. We never finish learning how to be regenerative leaders. The other aspect of it, this is the internal aspect. The external aspect is how do we work? How do we make decisions? And this is what brings in that idea of the circular systems of collaboration, where authority is horizontal, not top down. We as regenerative leaders do not tell people how things will happen. We bring people together, and together we design solutions. Therefore, in the project, in order to design the solution, you must get your client at the design table before you start. So if you're going to build a community center with disability access, you must get people who have disabilities to sit at the table and tell you why this center will not work and what it needs to have in order to provide access to people with particular disabilities, or if they're blind, or if they're mobility impaired and therefore have to move around in wheelchairs, or if they're deaf, or if they don't have limbs. So the design stage, and we'll be talking more about this technically next week, is critically important for the circular system of collaboration to kick in. You might want to explore the work of Frederic Laloux and reinventing organizations, and particularly his description of teal organizations and how they work in this idea of the self-organizing, co-creating approaches to business, education, healthcare, industry, even in multinational corporations, where there is no positional authority. The authority is given to the person who is an expert at the moment of the conversation. And we can talk about that later, and you can read about it more, or you can email me questions about this. So going forward, I'm going to leave you with a very simple equation. Regeneration is inversely proportional to E. The question to us all is, what does E represent? And I'll let you think about that a little minute. Again, it's a very simple answer again. This is the most difficult challenge that as a human species we have to face if we are going to be successful going forward into the future. And actually, as it says in the Brundtland report, being able to meet our own needs and ensuring that future generations can meet their own needs. So regeneration, as I said, is inversely proportional to ego. This is, unfortunately, the most difficult challenge that we have as individuals, and then as organizations and communities. Pride is our undoing. As soon as it is about me, or it's about the people I represent, then at the design table, I have an interest. I cannot let go of my ego sufficiently to allow the project to be more important than me, my self-interest, or the people that I represent. If I'm a politician, the mayor of a city, if I'm the CEO of a company and I have shareholders, if it's very difficult to, if I have run an NGO and I have victims of a disaster, I have to defend my interest, and that makes it very difficult for me and the people around a table to be able to design a regenerative solution, because what my imperative is, I have to go back and make money or save people's lives, and therefore I cannot think 200 years down the road. This is the real juggling problem and challenge for regenerative leaders. How can I balance the urgent needs of today with the long-term consequences of our actions? And these inevitably will come to roost. They will come and affect everything that we do. And therefore, one of the people in my research actually said, we have to be able to check, that is to leave our egos and our logos, our positions, our titles at the door. At the design table, there is nobody better than anybody else. When we actually create a sustainable building, the janitor who is actually managing the cleaning products and water must be at the management table, because he or she knows better than anybody else how to create a healthy environment for people who actually work or live in that building. So we need to think about everybody needs to be at the design table. So as you go forward into designing your project, whatever that is, think about these things and come back to the framework and make sure that you are actually using these elements to think about how you want to build your particular legacy.